The bar was already loud before the bikers walked in. Music pushed through the speakers so hard that the bass seemed to vibrate through the floor. Glasses clinked against each other behind the counter while the bartender rushed from one order to the next. Laughter burst out from different corners of the room, mixing with the low hum of conversations that overlapped in every direction. It was the kind of place people came to after a long day when they wanted to forget about work, bills, and everything waiting for them at home. Dim yellow lights hung above the bar, casting soft shadows across the tables. The air smelled like a mix of beer, fried food, and cigarette smoke drifting in every time the door opened. A few regulars sat on their usual stools, talking with the bartender like they had known him for years. In the back, a group of friends crowded around a pool table, arguing over whose turn it was while someone lined up a shot. Nothing about the night seemed unusual. A couple sat close together in one booth, sharing a plate of fries and whispering to each other over the noise. Two construction workers still in dusty boots leaned against the bar, slowly working through their drinks. A birthday group near the window kept cheering every time another round arrived. It felt like the kind of night where things would stay simple. People would drink, laugh too loudly, and eventually stumble out into the parking lot when the bartender called last round. Then the front door swung open again. A cold gust of night air pushed inside, and with it came the deep rumble of motorcycle engines fading in the distance. Several men stepped through the doorway wearing leather jackets and heavy boots. Their jackets carried patches and road dust, the kind that suggested they had been riding for hours before stopping here. The sound of their boots hitting the floor was heavy and confident, like they expected the room to adjust to them instead of the other way around. A few people glanced over right away, not openly staring, just quick looks from the corner of their eyes. The bikers moved as a group toward the bar, pulling out stools and dropping onto them like they owned the space. One of them tapped the counter twice with his knuckles to get the bartender's attention, while another laughed loudly at something only his friends could hear. Their voices carried over the music without much effort. They spoke in deep, rough tones, interrupting each other, joking in ways that sounded more like challenges than humor. One of them slapped another on the back hard enough to make the stool scrape across the floor. Someone else kicked a spare chair out of the way with his boot. The bartender kept working, but he noticed them. You could tell by the way his eyes moved more carefully now, watching the group while still pouring drinks for everyone else. He had seen enough nights like this to know that groups of bikers sometimes came with a little extra trouble attached. Around the room, the mood shifted just a little. The birthday group by the window lowered their voices for a moment before starting their conversation again. The couple in the booth stopped whispering long enough to glance toward the bar. Even the pool game in the back slowed down as one of the players leaned his cue against the table and looked over. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like awareness. The kind of feeling people get when something louder and heavier enters a quiet space. The bikers ordered drinks, strong ones, and the bartender lined the glasses up across the counter. A few bottles clinked together as he poured. One biker raised his glass right away and took a long drink like he had been waiting for it all night. Another leaned back on his stool and stretched his arms out wide, taking up more space than he needed. Their laughter started to cut through the room more often now. One loud comment turned into another. A joke became a story told with big gestures and sharp bursts of laughter. Every few minutes, one of them slammed his hand on the counter or knocked his glass down a little too hard. People tried to go back to their own conversations, but it was harder now. The bikers had brought a different kind of energy into the bar. Not exactly a fight, not exactly harmless either. Just enough tension that anyone paying attention could feel it building in the background while the night kept moving forward. For a while, the noise in the bar kept everything moving like normal. Music filled the air, glasses slid across the counter, and people kept talking even though the bikers were getting louder with every drink. The bartender continued serving orders, trying to keep the rhythm of the night steady. Near the far end of the bar, a woman stood waiting for her drink. She had been there for several minutes, leaning one elbow lightly on the counter while watching the bartender move back and forth. She looked calm, like someone who was comfortable being out alone. Her posture was relaxed, but confident, the kind that made it clear she wasn't there to bother anyone and didn't expect to be bothered either. She wore a simple dark shirt and jeans, nothing flashy. Her hair fell over one shoulder while she checked her phone for a moment, then slipped it back into her pocket. A few people around her barely noticed her at first because the room was full and everyone had their own conversations going. But one of the bikers noticed. He had already finished 2 drinks and was leaning sideways on his stool, scanning the room like he was looking for something to entertain himself. His eyes stopped when they landed on her. At first, he just stared for a moment, a slow grin spreading across his face as he nudged the man sitting next to him. The second biker followed his gaze and chuckled under his breath. They whispered something to each other, their shoulders shaking with quiet laughter. A third biker leaned in, curious, and soon 3 of them were looking in the same direction. The woman didn't react at first. She was focused on the bartender who was finishing another order across the counter. She pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and waited patiently, like someone who had no interest in the noise happening further down the bar. The first biker slid off his stool. His boots hit the floor with a heavy thud as he walked toward her, moving with the slow confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to him. His friends watched with crooked smiles, already entertained by whatever he was about to do. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel someone standing there. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. Her expression stayed calm, but her eyes made it clear she had already sized up the situation. People nearby noticed the shift and glanced over for a second before pretending they hadn't. The biker leaned one arm against the bar, blocking part of her space. "Didn't see you here before," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him for a second, then turned her attention back toward the bartender. The silence seemed to irritate him more than anything she could have said. One of his friends laughed from behind him. "Looks like she's ignoring you," the friend called out. A few people around the bar shifted uncomfortably. The couple in the booth nearby stopped their conversation and watched quietly. The pool players in the back slowed their game again, their eyes drifting toward the bar. The biker leaned closer. "Come on," he said, reaching toward the fabric of her shirt like he thought he was being funny. "Don't act like you didn't see me." Her hand moved quickly and pushed his arm away before he could touch her. It wasn't aggressive, just firm. "Back up," she said calmly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight that several people nearby heard it clearly. For a brief second, the biker looked surprised. Then his face twisted into a mocking smile. Behind him, his friends started laughing louder, feeding the moment. "You telling me what to do now?" he said. She didn't step away. She stood exactly where she was, her posture straight and steady. "I told you to back up." The room seemed to tighten around them. Conversations nearby slowed or stopped completely. Even the bartender paused while setting a glass on the counter. The biker's grin faded into something sharper. He grabbed the front of her shirt suddenly, his hand closing around the fabric like he wanted to prove a point to everyone watching. Before anyone could react, he yanked hard. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the music. Her shirt ripped open at the shoulder, the fabric pulling apart in his hand as several people around the bar gasped. One woman near the window covered her mouth in shock, while a man standing beside her muttered something under his breath. For a moment, the biker just held the torn piece of fabric and laughed like it was the funniest thing in the room. His friends burst out laughing behind him, slapping the bar and whistling. The music kept playing, but the rest of the room seemed to freeze around them. Glasses stopped moving. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes near the bar shifted toward the woman standing there with the ripped shirt. For a split second after the fabric tore, the noise in the bar collapsed into silence. It was strange how quickly it happened. Just moments earlier, the room had been full of music, laughter, and the constant shuffle of people moving around. Now it felt like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire place. The music still played through the speakers, but suddenly it sounded distant, like it was coming from another building. Glasses that had been halfway to people's mouths stopped midair. A chair scraped softly somewhere near the back before going still. Everyone had seen it. The woman stood exactly where she had been, her shoulder exposed where the shirt had ripped. The torn fabric hung unevenly, and a piece of it was still clenched in the biker's fist. He looked proud of it, like he had just performed some kind of joke meant to impress his friends. Behind him, the other bikers were laughing loudly, their voices bouncing off the walls. But the rest of the room wasn't laughing. A man sitting 2 stools away slowly lowered his drink back onto the counter without taking a sip. The couple in the booth stared across the room, their conversation completely forgotten. Near the pool table, one of the players leaned his cue against the felt and crossed his arms, watching closely. The bartender froze for a moment behind the counter, a glass still in his hand. His eyes moved from the torn shirt to the biker's face, then back again, trying to decide how quickly this situation could get out of control. The laughter from the bikers kept going, but it started to sound awkward against the silence around them. One woman, near the window, whispered something to her friend, her voice barely louder than the hum of the speakers. Someone else muttered a quiet, "What the hell?" under his breath. No one stepped forward yet. It wasn't because people didn't care. It was the kind of moment where everyone needed a second to understand what had just happened. The brain catching up with the eyes. The biker in front of the woman still held the torn fabric like a trophy. His grin was wide, but it had a careless edge to it, the kind that came from thinking there would be no consequences. "You should have just talked," he said loudly, tossing the ripped piece onto the counter. One of his friends slapped the bar and laughed again, though the sound didn't spread through the room the way laughter normally does. It just sat there, heavy and uncomfortable. The woman didn't move right away. She didn't cover herself or step back the way some people might have expected. Instead, she stood there calmly, her shoulders squared, her expression steady. That seemed to confuse the biker more than anger would have. He tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction like he was waiting for shouting or panic. Something dramatic that would keep the moment entertaining for his friends. But it didn't come. The quiet in the bar kept stretching. At a table near the wall, a middle-aged man slowly shook his head, clearly disgusted by what he had just seen. A younger guy sitting beside him clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. People's eyes moved between the biker and the woman, waiting for the next move. Even the bartender had stopped working now. The glass he had been drying rested on the counter as he leaned forward slightly, ready to jump in if the situation got worse. One of the bikers further down the bar leaned over to his friend and whispered something, though his voice was low enough that no one else heard it. Whatever he said made the other man chuckle quietly, but the laughter faded quickly when he noticed how the rest of the room was staring. It wasn't just attention anymore. It was judgment. The biker who had ripped the shirt seemed to notice it too. His smile faded a little as he glanced around. The reactions he saw weren't admiration or amusement. They were hard stares. People weren't cheering him on. They were watching him the way people watch someone who just crossed a line. Still, he tried to shrug it off. "What?" he said loudly, spreading his hands slightly as if daring someone to challenge him. "Relax." No one answered. The silence pressed in harder. The woman finally shifted her weight slightly, straightening her posture even more. The torn fabric revealed part of her shoulder and upper arm, the dim bar lights falling across her skin. Several people nearby kept their eyes on her now, not just because of what had happened, but because of how calm she still looked. The biker followed their gaze without fully understanding why. For a moment, his eyes dropped toward her shoulder too, and that was when a few people at the bar noticed something different. At first, only a couple of people near the bar noticed it. The dim yellow lights above the counter cast a soft glow across the woman's exposed shoulder where the fabric had torn away. Most people were still focused on the shock of what had just happened. Their eyes moved between the biker and the ripped shirt, still trying to process the moment. But a man sitting 2 stools away leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed for a second as he looked more closely at the woman's shoulder. What he saw made his expression change, the confusion on his face slowly turning into something else. Recognition. The skin just below her shoulder wasn't bare. There was ink there, not a small decorative tattoo or a random design. It was dark, bold, and instantly recognizable to anyone who had seen it before. The curved lines, the globe, the anchor. The shape stood out clearly under the bar lights. The emblem of the United States Marine Corps. The man blinked once, just to make sure he wasn't mistaken. Then he leaned back slightly, his eyes flicking toward the biker and then back to the tattoo again. Another person nearby noticed his reaction and followed his gaze. A woman sitting at the corner of the bar tilted her head as she looked toward the exposed shoulder. Her eyes widened a little when the design became clear. "Wait," she whispered under her breath. The bartender saw where they were looking. He leaned forward just enough to get a clearer view. For a moment his face stayed neutral, but then his eyebrows lifted slightly as the image registered in his mind. He had seen that symbol before plenty of times. Veterans came through the bar often enough that the emblem wasn't unfamiliar. But seeing it here, in this exact moment, carried a different kind of weight. The woman still hadn't moved much. She stood with the same steady posture she had before, her shoulders squared, her chin level. If she was embarrassed or shaken by what had just happened, she didn't show it. The torn edge of the shirt exposed more of the tattoo now. The eagle perched above the globe, wings spread wide. The anchor behind it, dark lines etched into her skin with careful detail. Beneath the emblem, faint lettering curved along the lower edge. Semper Fi. A quiet murmur began spreading across the nearest tables. Not loud enough to break the silence, but enough that people were starting to realize what they were looking at. Heads turned. Eyes shifted. A few people leaned forward just slightly, the way people do when they want to confirm something without making a scene. The pool players in the back had noticed the shift in attention. One of them followed the direction of everyone's gaze until he spotted the exposed shoulder. He stared for a second, then let out a quiet whistle through his teeth. "Well, damn," he muttered to his friend. Near the booth by the wall, the middle-aged man who had shaken his head earlier leaned forward with a new look on his face. He had served in the military years ago, and the emblem was impossible to mistake. He knew exactly what it meant. Back at the bar, the biker who had ripped the shirt still hadn't realized what the room was seeing. He was watching the woman's face instead, waiting for anger or fear or some kind of reaction he could mock in front of his friends. But her expression stayed calm, almost controlled. The biker frowned slightly. "What?" he said again, glancing around at the room. The reactions he was getting didn't make sense to him. People weren't shocked anymore. They weren't whispering about the torn shirt. They were staring at something else. One of his friends noticed it first. The biker sitting closest to the woman leaned forward, squinting toward her shoulder. His grin faded slowly as the tattoo came into view. He muttered. He nudged the man beside him and nodded toward the woman. The second biker looked too. His eyes scanned the exposed skin for a moment before locking onto the emblem. His laughter stopped immediately. The two men exchanged a quick glance that was very different from the jokes they had been sharing just minutes earlier. The first biker's posture shifted slightly on his stool. The woman still hadn't spoken. She simply adjusted her stance a fraction, the movement making the Marine Corps emblem even more visible under the light. The biker standing in front of her finally followed the direction of everyone's gaze. His eyes dropped toward her shoulder. For a moment, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then the symbol registered. The eagle, the globe, the anchor, and suddenly the room didn't feel the same anymore. The moment the emblem registered, something in the room shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic at first. No one jumped up or shouted. But the energy that had been hanging in the air since the shirt tore began to change in a way everyone could feel. People looked at the woman differently now. Just seconds earlier, many of them had been staring because of the shock of what had happened. Now their attention settled on the tattoo and what it represented. The eagle, the globe, and the anchor sat clearly on her shoulder under the dim lights, the dark ink sharp against her skin. The whispers that had started near the bar slowly spread across the room. Marine Corps, someone murmured quietly. A man sitting 2 stools down nodded to himself, as if confirming what he already knew. He had spent years around service members and had seen that emblem more times than he could count. There was no mistaking it. The bartender leaned both hands on the counter for a moment, watching the scene carefully. His expression had changed too. A few minutes earlier, he had been worried about a drunk biker causing trouble. Now he was looking at the situation through a completely different lens. Across the bar, the biker who had ripped the shirt stood frozen for a second longer than before. His eyes stayed on the tattoo as if his brain was trying to process new information that didn't match the picture he had in his head moments earlier. Behind him, one of his friends shifted uneasily on his stool. "Hey, man," the friend muttered under his breath, though it wasn't clear if he was warning him or just reacting to the realization. The loud confidence that had filled their group earlier began to fade around the edges. Their laughter had already stopped, and now even their posture seemed tighter, less relaxed than before. People around the room noticed it. At the pool table, one of the players slowly picked up his cue again but didn't take a shot. Instead, he leaned on it like a walking stick while watching the bar. "Dude messed with a Marine," he said quietly to his friend. His friend let out a low breath. "Looks that way." Near the window, the birthday group that had been cheering earlier had gone completely silent. A few of them leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table as they watched the scene unfold. The couple in the booth exchanged a glance. "That's not going the way he thought," the man whispered. Back at the bar, the woman finally moved slightly. She reached up and pulled the torn edge of her shirt into place, not to hide the tattoo, but simply to adjust the fabric. The motion was slow and controlled, the kind of movement that came from someone who was used to keeping their composure under pressure. Her calmness seemed to carry more weight now that everyone understood who they were looking at. The biker in front of her shifted his stance. His earlier grin was gone. In its place was a tight expression that looked somewhere between confusion and irritation. He glanced back at his friends briefly, maybe expecting them to laugh or make another joke. They didn't. Instead, they watched him carefully, the same way the rest of the room was watching. The silence in the bar felt heavier now, but not in the same way it had right after the shirt ripped. Before, the quiet had been about shock. Now it felt like anticipation. People weren't just reacting to what had happened anymore. They were waiting to see what would happen next. The woman's eyes stayed fixed on the biker. She didn't raise her voice or step closer. She didn't need to. Her posture alone carried a steady kind of authority that people in the room were beginning to recognize. The bartender slid one glass quietly across the counter to a customer who had been waiting, but even he kept glancing back toward the confrontation. The biker rubbed the back of his neck briefly, a small nervous movement that hadn't been there earlier. Someone near the middle of the bar whispered again. "Marine." Another voice replied softly. "Yeah, that explains a lot." The symbol on her shoulder seemed to change the entire balance of the moment. It wasn't just ink on skin. To many people in the room, it represented training, discipline, and a life built on facing difficult situations without backing down. Even people who had never served could feel the shift in respect that spread quietly through the crowd. One of the bikers sitting further down the counter cleared his throat awkwardly and looked away from the woman entirely. The man who had ripped the shirt finally spoke again, though his voice didn't carry the same cocky tone it had earlier. "Tattoo doesn't mean anything," he muttered, trying to sound dismissive. But the words landed flat in the silence. No one in the room seemed convinced, and the way everyone was watching him now made it clear that the night had turned in a direction he hadn't expected. The tension in the bar felt different now. Not louder, not more chaotic, just heavier, like the entire room had shifted its weight in one direction. Every person who had been watching the moment unfold understood something the biker seemed slow to accept. He had picked the wrong person. The woman stood steady in front of him, the torn edge of her shirt resting loosely against her shoulder. The Marine Corps emblem was still clearly visible under the lights. The eagle, the globe, the anchor. Dark ink that carried a reputation far beyond the bar walls. People around the room had stopped pretending to mind their own business. Conversations were gone now. Phones rested forgotten on tables. Drinks sat untouched on the counter. Everyone was watching. The biker shifted his feet again, the soles of his boots scraping faintly against the floor. His earlier swagger had drained away little by little. He kept glancing around the room, as if hoping someone would laugh and break the pressure building in the silence. No one did. Behind him, his friends had grown quieter than anyone had ever seen them that night. One of them leaned forward on the bar with both elbows, staring down at his drink like it had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. Another biker rubbed his chin slowly, eyes flicking between the woman and the floor. They understood the situation now. So did everyone else. At the pool table in the back, the man who had been holding his cue finally set it down against the wall. He crossed his arms and leaned against the table, clearly settling in to watch what happened next. "Guy really messed up," he murmured to his friend. His friend gave a slow nod. Near the window, the birthday group had shifted their chairs so they could see the bar more clearly. No one was smiling anymore. A woman in the group rested her chin on her hand while studying the scene with quiet focus. The bartender stood still behind the counter. His eyes moved between the biker and the woman, calculating the distance between them, the mood of the crowd, the body language of everyone involved. He had broken up enough fights over the years to recognize the moment before something important happened. But the woman still hadn't raised her voice. She simply looked at the biker with calm, steady eyes. Her posture was straight, balanced, controlled, the kind of stance that suggested she had spent years learning how to stand her ground. The biker cleared his throat. His attempt to brush off the tattoo a moment earlier hadn't convinced anyone. Even he seemed aware of that now. His fingers tapped once against the bar before stopping. "You think that scares me?" he said, though the question sounded forced. No one responded. The silence made his words hang in the air longer than he probably wanted. Across the room, a middle-aged man who had recognized the emblem earlier leaned back in his chair. His expression held a quiet kind of respect as he watched the woman remain completely composed. He had seen that look before. It was the kind of calm that came from experience, from training, from standing in difficult situations without losing control. Back at the bar, the woman finally moved again. She took one small step forward. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't rushed. Just a single, deliberate movement that closed the space between them by a few inches. The biker noticed immediately. His shoulders stiffened. The room seemed to lean forward with him. The lights above the counter cast sharper shadows across their faces now. The Marine Corps tattoo remained visible on her shoulder, the symbol almost seeming to carry its own presence in the moment. One of the bikers behind him muttered quietly under his breath. "Man." Another friend gave him a quick glance, silently agreeing. The woman's voice came out calm when she finally spoke. "You done?" she asked. Two simple words, but they carried across the room like a line drawn in the sand. The biker didn't answer right away. For the first time since he had walked into the bar, he looked unsure of himself. His eyes moved around the room again, and what he saw didn't help him. No laughter, no support. Just a crowd of people watching him realize exactly what kind of mistake he had made. The balance of the entire room had shifted away from him, and everyone could see it.